Hello everyone, and welcome back to the series where I build a graphical text editor from the ground up, starting from just the terminal. Today I'm going to walk through using raw mode in the terminal and build a simple run loop for the editor. So what is raw mode? In standard mode for the terminal, which is known as canonical mode, all of your input is saved up until you hit the return key. This makes perfect sense for writing commands, as you may want to edit them and you may have very long commands that contain multiple subcommands. But for a terminal application, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense and slows things down substantially. Using raw mode allows you to get the input as soon as it's typed, which works way better for a terminal application. It also disables things like echoing input to the terminal. Normally when you write something, you'll see what you're typing, but this can be a bit of a problem when you're working in something like, say, NeoVim, when you want to activate some sort of feature without necessarily having a bunch of text showing the things that you're typing. There are also a bunch of control characters that have their effects changed. Normally, if you're running a command from the terminal, you can cancel it by pressing Control-C. This sends a signal to the operating system to interrupt the program. However, I don't want it to be able to do that. I want to be able to use control characters for controlling the editor, and so I'll be changing settings to fix that as well. There are a bunch of other little things that happen in the background, but I'm not really going to be able to explain them very well, and there's a lot of little things, so I'm just not really going to bother. I will leave a link to documentation on the tools that I'm using to enter raw mode. But with that, let's take a look at the code. If you don't already understand C++ code, then this probably isn't the right video. I'm not going to be explaining all the basics. I'll just try my best to explain the things that are pertinent to the subject. I've included a few headers, but the important one for this video is called termios.h. This is what enables us to modify terminal behavior. It provides something called the termios structure, and this structure contains a bunch of different flags to modify the settings for a terminal. I'm only going to be manually editing a few of them, but I am also going to be using a function called cfMakeRaw that this header also provides. And it modifies a bunch of these settings, and I don't really have the time to go through all of that. Again, I'll link a manual page for this for those of you who are curious. Once we get into main, I'm getting some command line arguments here and checking to make sure that I have at least two. The first one is always going to be the name of the program. So the second one is the one that we actually want. And I'm going to be assuming that this second argument is going to be the name of the file that I want to edit. And in this case, I'm not going to be careful about checking it, but in the future, that is something that I will make sure to do. Once I've opened this file and gotten its context stored in a text buffer, in this case, I'm just using a static array for that. After that, I just close the file. Then you may recognize part of this next line. This prints an escape sequence that moves the program into the terminal's alternative buffer. You'll notice a slight difference, and that's just because that the number that I'm using here is in octal rather than in decimal, so base 8 rather than base 10. Next, I get the terminal's current settings, so that when the program's finished, I can reset it back to its original state. You really don't want to leave a terminal in raw mode once you're done running the program because, well, it's not really designed to run commands, and running commands from the terminal is kind of its primary function. So make sure to save your original settings so that you can reverse what you've done. These next few lines are all about setting the terminal to raw mode. This is where I use cfMakeRaw to set all the flags I want, and there are a few minor changes that I make to that. cfMakeRaw turns off something called opost, which is output processing flag, and I want that on. It messes with the printing if I leave it off. I'm also setting something called vmin and vtime. These two flags determine how many bytes I need to enter and how often in tenths of a second the system checks for those bytes. In this case, setting vmin to 0 means that when I call the read function, it can actually read nothing and return that, rather than hanging and waiting for me to enter something. And setting vtime to 1 means that the read function will time out for 1/10 of a second, so that it basically limits the frame rate to 10 frames per second. This isn't ideal, and I may end up changing this and putting in something a bit more useful, maybe something that sets it to 60 frames per second, but this will work for now. All of this means that the program can run continuously without me having to enter any input, which is important when you're looking at things like highlighting or running a language server or whatever. Finally, I'll tell the terminal to take all of these settings and apply them. Now the setup's done, and I'll just quickly go through the run loop. I've got ANSI escape sequence to clear the screen. Then I print the file's contents. This next part here is just for debugging, because, as I mentioned, raw mode disables the echoing feature in the terminal. I have to manually print in order to see what key I'm pressing and see if it actually registered it. In this case, I have one for keys that are printable and one for control keys or control characters. Things like null, new line, etc. Then I read from standard input, and the loop checks if the character I entered is the control Q character. At the end of the program, I revert the terminal settings back to how they were before, and then return to the normal terminal buffer. So now that we've seen the code, let me just show you what the program looks like when it's running. Here I have the program loading its own code file. In this case, there are no line numbers, since they aren't as important when I'm not building a line editor. Now if I press F, you'll see that it prints F, Q, T, etc. All of those get displayed, both the letter and the character code. If I press backspace, rather than removing any characters, it will just print the code that corresponds to backspace. The same for Control C, Control S, etc. And if I press Control Q, then it closes the program. So, now I have a working run loop, and I can set up an input system. Next episode, I plan on working on the text buffer, and after that, there'll probably be at least one episode where I'll be tying everything together and getting the editor up and running. There may be more, but I think it'll probably only take one episode. Also, I haven't really addressed the issue of scheduling these episodes, and for the moment, it seems like I'm able to support a schedule of one episode every 3 days or so. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep that schedule going, so I'll just be releasing these as soon as they're ready. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found this interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next episode.